Imagine, if you will, the absolute, oppressive density of true darkness. Imagine a world where the setting of the sun is not merely a cue to turn on a lamp, but a profound, biological mandate that shuts down the entire machinery of human civilization. Imagine standing in the heart of London in the year 1880. You are standing in the capital of the British Empire, the wealthiest, most industrialized, and most powerful metropolis in the history of the world.
Yet, as the winter sun dips below the horizon at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the city does not burst into a glittering skyline of neon and fluorescent light. Instead, it is swallowed by a suffocating gloom. The streets are choked with the acrid, sulfurous smog of a million coal fires, and the only illumination comes from the flickering, sickly yellow glow of gas lamps, casting long, monstrous shadows against the brick facades. To navigate your own home, you must carry a naked flame from room to room, constantly vigilant against the ever-present threat of a catastrophic fire.
This was the reality of the human experience just a few generations ago. The United Kingdom, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, did not see its first public electricity supply until the autumn of 1881. We have a tendency to romanticize the Victorian era. We picture elegant ladies in corseted dresses, gentlemen in top hats, horse-drawn carriages clattering over cobblestones, and grand intellectual conversations in opulent drawing rooms.
But this is a sanitized, cinematic illusion that completely ignores the brutal, visceral, and exhausting reality of daily life before the flick of a switch. The reality of the 19th century was a relentless physical struggle against darkness, cold, and time itself. This is the autopsy of a lost world.
This is the story of how people actually survived the night, the sheer, back-breaking labor required to maintain a civilized home without invisible currents of power flowing through the walls, and the profound psychological revolution that occurred when a small, unassuming town in Surrey finally flipped the switch on the modern era, forever altering human biology and our relationship with the sun. To understand the daily life of a world without electricity, you must first understand the absolute tyranny of the sun.
For the vast majority of human history, the rhythm of existence was dictated entirely by the solar cycle. When the sun came up, you worked. When the sun went down, you stopped. In the depths of a British winter, where daylight can last for fewer than 8 hours, the lack of cheap, safe artificial light was not just an inconvenience, it was a fundamental barrier to productivity and education. The architecture of the era was entirely designed around this desperate architecture of daylight.
Victorian homes featured massive sash windows, high ceilings, and strategically placed mirrors, all designed to capture and amplify every precious, fleeting photon of natural sunlight. Reading, writing, or sewing after dark was an excruciating strain on the eyes, often resulting in permanent vision damage. The night was a time of enforced idleness, a time when the world shrank to the small, flickering radius of a candle or a hearth fire. And the night was profoundly terrifying. Before electricity, darkness was synonymous with danger, disease, and crime.
The psychological fear of the dark was deeply embedded in the cultural consciousness. To walk the streets of London, Manchester, or Glasgow after midnight was to step into an abyss where footpads, thieves, and murderers operated with near total impunity. The affluent hired link boys, poor children who carried flaming torches to guide them through the labyrinthine, pitch-black streets for a few pennies. The dark was not just an absence of light, it was an active, malevolent presence that had to be constantly pushed back with fire.
Enceladus, and fire was the ultimate demanding master of the Victorian home. The entire domestic ecosystem revolved around the management of the flame. If you were a member of the upper or middle classes, you did not manage this fire yourself. You outsourced the physical agony to an army of domestic servants. The archetype of this grueling existence was the scullery maid, or the tweenie. Her entire life was a ceaseless battle against soot and ash. In the freezing, pitch-black hours of 4 o'clock in the morning, long before the family awoke, she would rise. Her first task was to physically carry heavy metal scuttles filled with raw coal up several flights of stairs to every fireplace in the house. She had to kneel on the freezing floor, clean out the greasy, choking ashes from the previous night, lay the kindling, and nurse the new fires to life. Without these fires, the uninsulated brick houses of the era were essentially iceboxes. If the fires died, the pipes froze, the water stopped, and the house became uninhabitable.
This servant was the human precursor to the electric thermostat, functioning entirely on physical exhaustion and calloused knees. The physical toll of maintaining a home without electrical appliances is almost incomprehensible to the modern mind, and nowhere was this more agonizingly apparent than on wash day. Today, cleaning clothes requires throwing them into a machine and pushing a button. In the 1870s, Monday was traditionally wash day, and it was a terrifying 14-hour marathon of agonizing physical labor. The servants, or the housewife, had to manually pump hundreds of gallons of water, carry it to massive copper cauldrons, and build a raging fire beneath it to boil the water. The clothes were submerged in this boiling, caustic mixture of harsh lye soap and water, and then physically agitated using a heavy wooden dolly or scrubbed until the knuckles bled on a ridged washboard. The heavy, soaking wet woolen garments, weighing dozens of pounds, then had to be manually hoisted out of the boiling water, wrung out by hand using an iron mangle that frequently crushed fingers, and hung out to dry in the soot-filled London air, which often meant they had to be washed all over again. The sheer caloric expenditure required simply to have clean clothing meant that most working-class people wore the exact same garments for weeks or even months at a time. Hygiene was an extreme luxury purchased entirely through human sweat. But what about the evenings? Enceladus. Surely the Victorians had artificial light? They did, but it was a toxic, dangerous, and incredibly filthy compromise. By the mid-19th century, the grand streets and affluent homes of Britain were illuminated by gaslight. The gas was manufactured by baking coal in massive industrial retorts, capturing the highly flammable gas and piping it through the city. Gaslighting was a miracle compared to the dim, sputtering light of a tallow candle, but it was a deeply flawed miracle. Gas lamps did not burn with a steady, clean glow. They flickered violently, hissed constantly, and emitted a faint, highly unpleasant odor of sulfur and rotten eggs. More terrifyingly, gaslighting was an active biological hazard. A gas jet was a naked, open flame burning inside the living room. It literally sucked the oxygen out of the enclosed spaces of Victorian parlors, replacing it with carbon dioxide and low levels of carbon monoxide. People frequently complained of gas headaches, nausea, and exhaustion after spending an evening reading under the gaslight. The flames were so hot that they scorched the ceilings, and the incomplete combustion left a permanent, greasy layer of black soot on the wallpaper, the curtains, and the lungs of the inhabitants. Houseplants would instantly wither and die in a gaslit room. And then there was the ever-present catastrophic threat of explosion. A single loose pipe fitting, a momentary drop in pressure followed by a surge, or a forgotten valve could fill a home with invisible, highly explosive gas. The Victorian newspapers were filled with grim accounts of entire families being blown to pieces or asphyxiated in their sleep by their own lighting system. Gas was a brilliant innovation, but it was a wild, untamed beast living in the parlor. The profound terror of the Victorian night was amplified exponentially by the environmental catastrophe of the Industrial Revolution itself.
The millions of coal fires burning simultaneously to hold back the cold and cook the food did not just produce heat, they produced an astronomical volume of thick, yellow, sulfurous smoke.
When the weather conditions were right, specifically during an atmospheric inversion, this smoke would become trapped at ground level, mixing with the natural fog of the River Thames to create the infamous pea souper. These fogs were not merely a mist. They were a physical, suffocating density that entirely blocked out the sun during the day and rendered the already weak gas lamps completely useless at night. The smog was so thick that visibility was often reduced to less than 2 feet. If you were caught outside during a severe pea souper, the darkness was absolute and disorienting. People would literally have to feel their way along the brick walls of the buildings just to find their own front doors. The police had to carry massive flaming flambeaux just to be seen. The death toll during these events was staggering. Not only did thousands die from acute respiratory failure, choking on the toxic, acidic air, but hundreds of people simply walked off the docks and drowned in the River Thames because they could not see the edge of the water. The darkness of the Victorian city was not just inconvenient, it was a lethal environmental weapon.
And yet, despite this lethal darkness, the machinery of the city had to keep moving, relying on an army of specialized, highly endangered workers. Perhaps the most iconic yet tragic figure of this era was the lamplighter. Every single evening at dusk, thousands of men and boys had to physically walk every street, alley, and square in the country, carrying a long pole with a small flame at the end to manually ignite the gas lamps. They had to do this in the pouring rain, in the freezing snow, and in the suffocating smog. And at dawn, they had to walk the exact same routes to turn them off.
It was a massive, incredibly expensive logistical nightmare. But more terrifyingly, it was highly dangerous. If a valve was faulty, the gas would pool inside the glass lantern. When the lamplighter reached up with his pole to ignite it, the lantern would violently explode, sending razor-sharp shrapnel into his face and eyes. Blindness and severe burns were considered routine occupational hazards for the men who literally brought light to the empire.
The sheer fragility of a lighting system that required thousands of human beings to manually ignite it every single night is staggering when compared to the effortless, centralized switch of the electrical grid. To truly grasp the absolute horror of a world without electricity, one must look at the terrifying reality of Victorian medicine. Today, an operating room is the most heavily illuminated, sterile, and technologically monitored environment on Earth. In 1875, surgery was a desperate, bloody gamble performed in the dim, unreliable light of day. The grand operating theaters of London's major hospitals, like St. Thomas's, were built with massive glass skylights specifically designed to capture the sun. But what happened if a patient needed emergency surgery to amputate a crushed leg at midnight, or during a massive winter smog when the skylights were completely blacked out? The surgeons had to operate by the flickering, unsteady light of gas lamps, or even handheld candles held by terrified nurses. The shadows cast by the surgeon's own hands would constantly obscure the surgical field.
Trying to tie off a microscopic bleeding artery in the dim, flickering light of a candle while the patient thrashed in the agonizing pain of rudimentary anesthesia was a scene of unparalleled nightmare. Furthermore, without electricity, there was no refrigeration. The concept of a blood bank was physically impossible. You could not store blood, vaccines, or sensitive medications because they would immediately spoil in the heat of the summer. There were no electric centrifuges to separate blood components, no electrocardiograms to monitor the heart, and no X-ray machines to see the shattered bones beneath the skin. If a premature baby was born in the winter, there were no electric incubators to keep it warm. The nurses simply had to wrap the infant in hot water bottles and pray that the fire in the hearth did not die. The medical profession fought a desperate losing battle against disease and death,
using instruments that were limited entirely by the mechanical restrictions of the pre-electric age.
The transition to electric light and electric refrigeration in the early 20th century did more to drastically lower the human mortality rate than almost any surgical technique ever invented. The absence of electricity also dictated a completely different psychological landscape, defined by a profound, agonizing isolation. When the sun went down and the doors were locked against the dangerous streets, the Victorian family was trapped in a small, dimly lit room. There was no radio to provide voices from the outside world. There was no television to offer a window into another reality.
There was no telephone to instantly communicate with a doctor, a police officer, or a loved one in another city. If a child fell deathly ill at 2 a.m, you could not simply pick up a phone and call for an ambulance. Someone had to physically run out into the pitch-black, freezing, dangerous streets to find a doctor, praying they were awake. The night was a time of absolute, terrifying silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire or the distant, muffled sounds of the city. This deep psychological isolation, combined with the incredibly poor quality of the artificial light, directly fueled the massive Victorian obsession with the supernatural, the occult, and ghost stories. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine, constantly trying to make sense of visual input. But a tallow candle or a flickering gas lamp does not provide a steady, clean light. It provides a constantly shifting, dancing, unstable illumination. The light physically flickers, causing the shadows on the walls to constantly move and warp. When you are sitting in absolute silence, isolated from the world, reading by a light source that is actively playing tricks on your visual cortex, the mind naturally begins to fill the shifting shadows with monsters. The Victorian ghost story, the genre that gave us Dracula, Frankenstein, and the haunting tales of Charles Dickens, was not just a literary fad. It was a direct psychological byproduct of living in a world where the darkness was never truly conquered, and where the light itself seemed to be alive and moving. The incandescent bulb did not just banish the physical darkness, it banished the ghosts, replacing the terrifying, shifting shadows with a harsh, sterile, and uncompromising clarity. The economic reality of the pre-electric home was also defined by a staggering inefficiency that locked women into a state of perpetual domestic servitude. Because there were no electric appliances, every single caloric requirement of the household had to be generated by human muscle. There were no electric irons. Clothes were pressed using heavy, solid slabs of iron that had to be physically heated in the roaring coals of the fireplace, a process that frequently resulted in severe burns and ruined garments. There were no electric vacuum cleaners. Rugs had to be hauled outside, hung over a line, and violently beaten with a stick until the dust choked the air. There were no electric ovens with precise temperature controls. Baking required a masterful, intuitive understanding of how to bank a coal fire to achieve a specific heat, a skill that took years to develop and could easily result in a ruined meal and wasted expensive ingredients. The sheer volume of physical labor required merely to maintain a baseline level of survival in a Victorian home meant that the concept of leisure time for the working-class woman was a complete myth. Her entire existence was consumed by the mechanical maintenance of the household. The electric revolution, the introduction of the electric washing machine, the electric iron, the vacuum cleaner, and the refrigerator did not just make life easier, it executed the greatest mass emancipation of female labor in human history. It broke the chains of the washboard and the coal scuttle, freeing billions of hours of human potential that had previously been squandered on the brutal, repetitive task of manually fighting against the dark and the dirt. The switch on the wall was the most powerful engine of social change ever invented. This was the dark, exhausting, and soot-stained reality of the British Empire at the absolute zenith of its global power. But in the autumn of 1881, the fundamental architecture of human existence was permanently altered in a location that no one would have suspected. It was not in the grand scientific academies of London or the massive industrial mills of Manchester. The revolution began in Godalming, a small, quiet, picturesque town nestled in the rolling hills of Surrey, just 30 miles southwest of London. Godalming was a traditional market town, but it possessed a specific geographical advantage that would propel it into the history books: the River Way. For centuries, the river had powered traditional watermills used to grind grain and manufacture leather. But in the late 1870s, the local town council was facing a highly modern problem. The private gas company that supplied the town's streetlights was attempting to aggressively raise its prices. The council, furious at this monopolistic extortion, decided to seek an alternative. They were approached by the engineering firm of Siemens Brothers, who proposed a radical, almost science fiction solution. Instead of piping highly explosive gas through the streets, Siemens proposed using the kinetic energy of the River Way to spin a newly invented machine called a generator. This generator would push an invisible, magical force called electricity through solid copper wires, which would then illuminate glass bulbs suspended above the streets. On an incredibly historic evening in late September 1881, the town of Godalming gathered in the streets. The engineers at the Westbrook Mill engaged the massive wooden water wheel. The wheel turned the generator, and instantly, without a match, without a flame, and without the hiss of gas, the streets of Godalming were bathed in the steady, clean, brilliant white glow of electric light. Godalming became the very first place on the entire planet to possess a public electricity supply. The town did not just light its streets. The Siemens Company laid cables directly into the homes and shops of private consumers, who paid for the invisible current to illuminate the newly invented incandescent bulbs designed by Joseph Swan. If you are beginning to realize how the invisible infrastructure of electricity completely separates our modern reality from the brutal physical exhaustion of the Victorian era, take a moment to leave a like on this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. It genuinely helps expose these hidden historical tipping points that continue to shape our daily lives. The psychological impact of that first electric light cannot be overstated. For a Victorian citizen, accustomed to the terrifying, living, breathing nature of fire, the electric bulb was a miracle of profound sterility. It was light without heat, without smoke, without soot, and without the threat of imminent asphyxiation. It was an ethereal, captive star suspended in a glass vacuum. You could read a book without ruining your eyes. You could breathe the air in your parlor without getting a headache. You could fall asleep with the subconscious terror that your home would burn to the ground before morning. The wealthy elites from London took specialized train trips down to Surrey just to walk the streets of Godalming at night and stare in bewildered awe at the glowing glass orbs. It was the absolute, undeniable dawn of the modern world. However, the irony of the Godalming experiment is that it was ultimately a spectacular commercial failure. The technology was simply too new and the infrastructure was too fragile. In the summer, when the River Way ran low, the water wheel couldn't turn fast enough, and the lights would dim to a dull, useless orange. The Siemens engineers eventually had to install a dirty, coal-fired steam engine as a backup, defeating the purpose of the clean, renewable hydropower. Furthermore, the local gas company, terrified of this new competitor, aggressively slashed its prices, undercutting the cost of the electricity. By 1884, just 3 years after they had made global history, the town of Godalming was forced to rip up the electric cables, turn off the generator, and humbly return to the flickering, toxic glow of gaslighting. The first electric grid was defeated by market economics. But the genie was out of the bottle, and the psychological barrier had been permanently shattered. The knowledge that the night could be conquered cleanly and instantly spread like a virus. Within a year, Thomas Edison opened the Holborn Viaduct power station in London, proving that massive, centralized coal-fired generation could light an entire city block. The Great Transition had begun. Over the next few decades, the massive, chaotic, and incredibly dangerous infrastructure of the Victorian gas network was slowly replaced by the silent, humming copper wires of the electrical grid. But the arrival of electricity did not merely illuminate the dark. It executed a fundamental, profound, and deeply unnatural alteration of human biology. Before 1881, humanity's sleep patterns were dictated by the darkness. Historical and biological research has revealed that before the widespread use of artificial light, human beings did not sleep in a single, uninterrupted 8-hour block. They engaged in what is known as biphasic sleep. People would go to bed shortly after dusk, sleep for roughly 4 hours, and then wake up in the middle of the night for an hour or two. During this first waking, people would read by candlelight, pray, talk, or simply sit in the quiet darkness.
They would then return to bed for a second sleep until dawn. This was the natural biological rhythm of the human animal, attuned to the long, dark nights of winter. Electricity completely annihilated this biological rhythm. By providing cheap, bright, and effortless light at midnight, electricity allowed humanity to successfully declare war on the night. The electric light birthed the modern concept of nightlife. It allowed theaters, restaurants, and social clubs to operate deep into the early hours of the morning.
But far more significantly, it allowed the factories and the mills of the Industrial Revolution to implement the terrifying concept of the night shift. If the factory floor was as brightly lit at 2 in the morning as it was at 2 in the afternoon, there was no longer any economic justification to stop the machines. Electricity allowed the titans of industry to sever the workers' biological connection to the sun, transforming human labor into a 24-hour, uninterrupted mechanical process.
The 8-hour workday and the consolidated 8-hour sleep cycle were not natural biological imperatives. They were the direct, artificial consequences of the incandescent bulb. We sacrificed our natural sleep rhythms on the altar of uninterrupted productivity. When we analyze the moral complexity of the electrical revolution, we are forced to confront the terrifying reality of our absolute dependency. Electricity was the great liberator. It freed the scullery maid from the agonizing tyranny of the coal scuttle.
It freed the housewife from the 14-hour torture of the wash day by powering the electric washing machine. It eradicated the respiratory diseases caused by gas fumes in unventilated parlors. It allowed for the invention of the electric refrigerator, virtually eliminating the mass food poisoning and bacterial diseases that plagued the Victorian summer. It literally doubled the effective lifespan of the human race by sanitizing our environment and allowing for modern medical machinery. But in exchange for this liberation, we surrendered our autonomy.
We entered into a Faustian bargain with the grid. The Victorian citizen, for all their suffering, was the master of their own survival. They knew how to build a fire, they knew how to preserve food with salt and ice, and they knew how to navigate the world without the assistance of a silicon microchip. They were deeply physically connected to the harsh realities of the natural world. Modern humanity has completely severed that connection. We live in a highly fragile, highly complex, and entirely artificial bubble of continuous power. The philosophical conclusion to the saga of 1881 is a stark, blaring warning about the fragility of modern civilization. We take for granted the invisible, humming magic flowing through the copper veins of our homes. We assume that the light will always obey the flick of the switch, that the refrigerator will always remain cold, and that the servers hosting our collective knowledge will never lose power.
But when the grid fails, when a massive storm, a cyber attack, or a systemic failure plunges a modern city into darkness, we do not revert to the resilient, capable survivalists of the Victorian era. We instantly descend into panic. We do not know how to build the fire. We do not know how to purify the water.
and we cannot navigate the dark. The arrival of electricity in Godalming in 1881 was the moment humanity conquered the night, but it was also the exact moment we became absolute, helpless slaves to the machine that conquered it for us.
Enceladus. If this deep dive into the brutal reality of Victorian life, the terrifying physical toll of a world without electricity, and the true cost of our modern convenience changed the way you view the switch on your wall, please subscribe and leave a comment below with your thoughts. I read every single one of them. Suggest which historical event, forgotten technology, or hidden psychological operation we should investigate in the next video, and I'll see you there.